The blood pooling on the imported marble floor belonged to the only woman the most feared boss in Chicago ever loved. Elena vanished on their anniversary, leaving behind an empty, shattered penthouse. But she fled in the dark, never knowing Pietro's heavy silver signet ring now harbored her greatest secret, a positive pregnancy test. Chicago was a city of ghosts, and Pietro Serra was the man who manufactured them. As the undisputed head of the Serra syndicate, Pietro ruled the Midwestern underworld with a calculating glacial brutality that left absolutely no room for error. He was a man carved from ice and violence, a predator in a bespoke suit who feared nothing and spared no one. Except for her. Elena Ferrari was the single, glaring anomaly in Pietro's blood-soaked world. She was not a hardened, cynical mafia princess born into the life, nor was she a sleek, hollow socialite draped on his arm for public appearances. Elena was a forensic accountant, a woman possessing a brilliant, labyrinthine mind, sharp enough to launder millions through shell corporations and erase digital footprints without leaving a single trace. She was also a woman of soft, generous curves, possessing a full-figured, radiant beauty that drove Pietro to the absolute brink of madness. Where the rest of the world saw Pietro as a merciless monster, Elena saw the man who worshipped the very ground she walked on. He was ruthlessly protective of her, fiercely possessive of her lush, yielding body, and endlessly proud of her razor-sharp intellect. To Pietro, her softness was the only peace he had ever known. Today was their first anniversary. Pietro had promised her a rare night away from the shadows and paranoia of their daily lives, planning an extravagant, private dinner at their fortress of a penthouse overlooking the frigid waters of Lake Michigan. But in the quiet hours leading up to the celebration, a terrifying storm was brewing within the heavily fortified walls of their sanctuary. Elena stood frozen in the sprawling master bathroom, staring down at the slender plastic stick resting on the marble vanity. Two distinct pink lines glared back at her. She was pregnant. A profound, dizzying wave of both terror and overwhelming joy crashed over her chest. Carrying the heir to the Serra syndicate was a death sentence in their current, volatile climate. The Caro family, led by the vicious, unpredictable, and fiercely ambitious Silvio Caro, had been encroaching on Pietro's territory for months. Silvio was a poisonous snake who specialized in finding a powerful man's weakness and squeezing it until the man broke. Elena knew with absolute certainty that she was Pietro's only weakness. Suffocating panic began to set in. She had to think logically, relying on the quiet, stoic resilience that had kept her alive and thriving in the criminal underworld. She could not tell Pietro. Not yet. If he knew she was pregnant, his carefully measured protective instincts would turn explosive and reckless. He would start an all-out street war to wipe out Silvio Caro before the baby arrived, throwing caution to the wind, risking his own life, and plunging the entire city into a massive bloodbath. She needed time to formulate a strategic plan. Hearing Pietro's heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching in the hallway, Elena moved with frantic desperation. She broke the hard plastic casing of the pregnancy test, carefully extracting the small, fragile paper strip that held the two undeniable lines. She shoved the broken plastic pieces deep into the bottom of the trash bin, covering them with tissues, and hastily placed the small paper strip on Pietro's dresser, intending to slip it into her purse the moment his back was turned. But the heavy oak door swung open before she could retrieve it. Pietro walked in looking exhausted, the immense weight of the syndicate resting heavily on his broad shoulders. Yet his dark, calculating eyes softened entirely the moment they landed on Elena. He crossed the vast room in slow, deliberate strides, wrapping his large, scarred arms around her waist. He pulled her soft, plush frame flush against his hardened muscles, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled her sweet scent, murmuring low, gravelly words about how beautiful she looked and how much he needed this night with her. Elena forced a bright smile, her heart hammering violently against her ribs like a trapped bird. She kissed his cheek, making a quick, breathless excuse about needing to check on the catering arrangements, and slipped smoothly out of the room. Left alone in the quiet bedroom, Pietro began to unbutton his shirt, preparing to change into his evening suit. That was when his sharp eyes caught it. A tiny, peculiar paper strip resting conspicuously near his leather watch box. He paused. He was a man trained to notice every minute detail, a survivor who overlooked nothing. He picked it up between his large fingers, inspecting the 2 pink lines. He knew exactly what this was. A massive jolt of electricity shot straight through his chest, stopping his breath. Elena was pregnant. He was going to be a father. A fierce, overwhelming and primal surge of possessive joy consumed him, threatening to drop him to his knees. But as the initial shock faded, a cold realization washed over him. He understood her fear. He knew exactly why she had hidden the test, why her smile had seemed so fragile moments ago. The escalating war with Silvio Caro was reaching a dangerous boiling point. Pietro realized instantly that he needed to handle the Caro threat permanently before confronting Elena, to hand her the safety and peace she truly deserved. He wanted to keep this beautiful secret close to him, a silent, binding vow to protect his growing family. Pietro walked over to his velvet-lined jewelry box and picked up his capo signet ring. It was a massive, custom-made piece of solid silver, bearing the fearsome Serra family crest. The heavy crest was designed to flip open, revealing a tiny, secure, watertight compartment used by his ruthless ancestors for carrying powdered poison. Pietro carefully folded the small paper pregnancy strip until it was a tiny square, tucked it gently inside the hidden compartment, and snapped the crest shut. He slipped the heavy silver ring onto his finger. The metal felt cool and grounding against his skin, carrying the literal proof of his future, a secret they now shared, even if she did not know it. The anniversary dinner was supposed to be a sacred, impenetrable sanctuary, but the underworld does not respect sacred days. While Pietro was secluded in his soundproof study, taking a brief but mandatory, secure call regarding an intercepted arms shipment, Elena stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the dining room. Suddenly, her burner phone vibrated in her pocket. It was an encrypted text message containing a series of photographs that made the blood run freezing cold in her veins. The grainy images showed Pietro's elite security detail lying dead in the alleyway below their building, their blood staining the concrete. The next message was a hacked live video feed of the penthouse lobby. Silvio Caro, flanked by a dozen heavily armed mercenaries, was stepping into the private biometric elevator that led directly to their floor. The final text read, "I am coming up for the boss's pretty little accountant. Stay and watch him die trying to protect you, or leave through the service chute and I let him live. I only want to break him tonight. Your choice, Elena." Silvio Caro was not just a territorial rival. He was a twisted, psychological sadist. He knew Pietro's men were currently stretched thin across the city, due to a string of coordinated warehouse fires. Elena realized with horrifying crystalline clarity that Silvio had orchestrated those massive distractions downtown, specifically to leave the penthouse completely vulnerable. If Silvio found her here, Pietro would fight to the absolute death to defend her. The inevitable crossfire would violently end the life of the tiny baby growing inside her, and it would undoubtedly result in the death of the man she loved more than her own breath. Eleanor's greatest hidden strength had always been her ability to process data and make impossible, cold calculations in a fraction of a second. The emotional math was excruciating, but the logic was utterly undeniable. Her physical presence was the sole catalyst for Pietro's immediate destruction. If she vanished, Silvio's leverage evaporated into thin air. Without her there to protect, Pietro could maneuver, fight, and survive. She did not have the luxury of time to write a note or explain her actions. She sprinted to the hidden safe in the pantry, grabbing her emergency go-bag, thick stacks of untraceable cash, and a secondary, heavily encrypted laptop she used strictly for dark web routing. She paused at the entrance to the hallway, taking one last, agonizing look at the heavy oak door of Pietro's study. Tears spilled over her cheeks. She pressed a trembling hand tightly to her stomach, silently promising her unborn child that this horrific sacrifice was the only way to ensure their survival. Utilizing her deep knowledge of the historic building's archaic ventilation and service tunnels, Elena bypassed the incoming hit squad, slipping quietly into the unforgiving, freezing Chicago night. 10 minutes later, Pietro emerged from his study, adjusting his cuffs, fully expecting to find his beautiful wife waiting for him by the candlelit table. Instead, the deafening roar of explosives shattered the peace as the reinforced penthouse door was blown completely off its hinges. The air instantly filled with thick smoke and the acrid smell of cordite. Silvio Caro strolled into the center of the ruined living room, surrounded by his heavily armed enforcers. Pietro did not flinch, nor did he panic. His hand moved instinctively to the small of his back, drawing his firearm with terrifying, blinding speed, aiming directly at Silvio's head. Silvio held up his hands in a mocking, theatrical gesture of peace, a nasty sneer twisting his features. His dark eyes eagerly scanned the room, expecting to see a terrified woman. Instead, he looked genuinely confused. "Where is the lovely Elena?" he taunted. "I came to deliver a special anniversary gift, but it seems the gilded cage is empty." Pietro's heart stopped completely in his chest, an icy dread wrapping around his lungs, but his face remained a flawless mask of absolute, lethal calm. He did not ask questions. He pulled the trigger. He shot 2 of Silvio's lead men before they could even blink, the suppressed gunfire echoing sharply in the large, smoky room. Silvio screamed, diving violently behind the massive kitchen island as his remaining men opened fire. Pietro moved like a shadow, a true predator unleashed in his own territory. He used angles and cover with deadly precision. Within 90 seconds, Silvio's men were bleeding out on the expensive marble floor. Silvio himself, a coward at heart, barely managed to escape through the shattered balcony glass, using a rappel line to drop to a lower terrace and flee into the night. Pietro ignored the fleeing rat. He tore through the ruined penthouse like a madman, screaming Elena's name until his voice cracked. He searched the master bathroom, the bedroom, the walk-in closets. Empty. There was no blood, no sign of a physical struggle, only the lingering, intoxicating scent of her vanilla perfume and the open grate of the hidden service access panel in the kitchen. She had run. His remaining lieutenants arrived frantically minutes later, finding their boss standing dead center in the ruined, smoke-filled dining room. Pietro's chest heaved, a monstrous, world-ending rage building in his veins. He looked down at his trembling hand, staring at the heavy silver signet ring on his finger. He pressed his thumb hard against the crest, feeling the microscopic, perfect seam where her positive pregnancy test was securely hidden. She had vanished into the bitter winter wind, carrying his child, thinking she was completely alone. She did not know that he knew. She did not know that the very proof of their future was resting flush against his skin, fueling a dark, obsessive fire that would happily consume the entire eastern seaboard if it meant bringing her home. Pietro turned slowly to his heavily armed lieutenants, his eyes completely hollow, his voice a quiet, terrifying rasp that promised hell on earth. Lock down the entire city. Ground every single plane, stop every train, block every highway, going in or out. If anyone hides her, kill them. If anyone touches her, peel their skin off. Find my wife. 6 agonizing months passed. The relentless, bloody search for Elena Ferrari became a dark urban legend spoken of only in whispers within the underworld. Pietro Serra turned Chicago into a literal war zone, systematically and viciously dismantling Silvio Caro's entire operation, piece by bloody piece, in his desperate hunt for answers. He became a terrifying phantom of vengeance, sleeping rarely, eating barely, sustained only by the heavy weight of the silver ring on his finger and the promise of what it held. Meanwhile, hidden away in the bleak, snowy, working-class outskirts of Boston, Elena was surviving. She had expertly utilized her forensic accounting skills to create a flawless ghost identity, working quietly as a late-night data entry clerk in a massive, unheated logistics warehouse. Her soft, generous curves were now accompanied by a prominent, beautifully swelling belly that she hid under heavy winter coats. It was deep winter, and the cold was biting, but she endured with a quiet, fierce strength. She lived in a cramped, drafty apartment, carefully rationing her physical cash, always looking over her shoulder. She missed Pietro with a deep, physical ache that frequently left her sobbing and gasping for air in the middle of the night, but she firmly believed her painful sacrifice was keeping the man she loved alive. She had absolutely no idea that her final, desperate digital maneuver on the night she fled had left a microscopic anomaly in a dummy shell company's ledger. It was a brilliant piece of deceptive coding, nearly invisible to anyone else, but Elena was a creature of habit. In her haste to secure untraceable funds, she had left a signature string of code, a deeply hidden mathematical sequence in the routing numbers that only someone who intimately knew her work would ever recognize. Back in a subterranean bunker in Chicago, staring red-eyed at a massive wall of monitors alongside his best hackers, Pietro finally saw it. The anomaly. A small, rhythmic, undeniable digital pulse in a series of offshore accounts being quietly routed through a local Boston server. Pietro stood up slowly, never breaking eye contact with the glowing screen. His thumb absent-mindedly traced the silver crest of his signet ring, feeling the secret locked inside. A dark, predatory, and terribly beautiful smile broke across his exhausted face for the very first time in 6 months. He had finally found her. Boston was an entirely different kind of cold than Chicago. The wind coming off the Atlantic Ocean carried a bitter, damp chill that seeped deep into the bones, freezing the world in a perpetual layer of grey frost. In the cavernous, poorly lit expanse of the industrial shipping warehouse, Elena Ferrari pulled her thick woolen coat tighter around her swollen belly. She was 7 months pregnant now, her soft, generous curves carrying the undeniable, heavy weight of Pietro's child. Her back ached constantly, and her ankles were permanently swollen from standing on unforgiving concrete floors for 10 hours a night. But she never once complained. Every ache, every pang of exhaustion was a badge of honor, a silent testament to the fierce, unyielding resilience that had kept her and her baby alive this long. She worked the graveyard shift in the logistics department, a job she secured using a flawlessly forged identity. Her brilliant mind, once used to manipulate millions of dollars in international syndicates, was now reduced to auditing shipping manifests and cross-referencing freight barcodes. It was monotonous, grueling work, but the noise of the hydraulic forklifts and the anonymity of the midnight shift provided the perfect cover. She kept her head down, spoke to no one, and diligently stashed away every spare dollar she earned into a waterproof duffel bag hidden beneath the floorboards of her cramped apartment. But Elena was completely unaware that the shadows of her past were rapidly closing in from two entirely different directions. Silvio Caro was a desperate, cornered animal. Over the last 6 months, Pietro Serra had unleashed a biblical level of destruction upon the Caro syndicate. Silvio had lost his territories, his safe houses, his lieutenants, and his wealth. He was operating on borrowed time, hiding in squalid motels, constantly looking over his shoulder for the monster from Chicago. But a desperate man is a dangerous man. Silvio had spent his last remaining millions hiring a team of black market cyber mercenaries to scour the deep web for any trace of the woman who had caused his downfall. 2 days ago, they found the microscopic digital footprint Elena had accidentally left behind. Silvio immediately gathered his last 5 loyal enforcers, heavily armed them, and drove through the night toward Massachusetts. He needed leverage. He needed the one thing Pietro Serra valued more than his own soul. At the exact same time, a sleek, unmarked Gulfstream jet was slicing through the freezing night sky, making an emergency descent into a private airfield just outside of Boston. Pietro Serra sat perfectly still in the leather cabin seat, looking out the window into the pitch-black sky. He wore a tailored black overcoat, a tactical Kevlar vest strapped beneath his shirt, and an arsenal of high-caliber weaponry secured to his large frame. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying stone, but beneath the surface, a wild, violent storm was raging. He had barely slept since the night his penthouse was destroyed. He was running entirely on adrenaline, caffeine, and the obsessive, consuming need to feel Elena's soft body in his arms again. He absently rubbed his thumb over the heavy silver signet ring on his finger, drawing strength from the secret it contained. The warehouse clock struck 2 in the morning. Elena was sitting alone in the glass-paneled supervisor office overlooking the main loading dock, auditing a stack of international freight invoices. The massive corrugated metal doors of the loading bay were rolled down, securing the facility from the freezing wind. The warehouse was quiet, save for the hum of the overhead halogen lights and the distant rumble of a single forklift operating in Sector 4. Suddenly, a massive, deafening crash shattered the silence. A heavy, reinforced armored SUV slammed violently through the corrugated metal doors of the loading bay, tearing the steel off its tracks in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The vehicle screeched to a halt in the center of the concrete floor. Before the dust could even settle, 4 heavily armed men poured out of the doors, sweeping the area with assault rifles. Silvio Caro stepped out last, his face scarred and gaunt, his eyes scanning the cavernous room with manic intensity. "Spread out and find her," Silvio screamed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "She is here. Bring her to me alive. If she runs, shoot her in the legs." Up in the supervisor office, Elena's heart stopped. Pure, paralyzing terror seized her chest, but it lasted only a fraction of a second. The deep maternal instinct to protect her unborn child instantly overrode her fear. Her mind snapped into sharp, calculating focus. She dropped to the floor, crawling beneath the metal desk as a hail of bullets shattered the glass windows of her office, raining sharp shards down onto her back. She had anticipated the possibility of discovery. Over the last few months, she had secretly mapped every single inch of this warehouse in her mind. She knew the blind spots of the security cameras. She knew the structural layout of the storage racks, and she knew exactly where the emergency fire exits were located. She grabbed her heavy coat, wrapping it securely around her pregnant belly, and slipped out of the office through a secondary maintenance hatch in the floor that led directly into the maze of towering freight aisles. She moved as quickly as her heavily pregnant body would allow, darting between massive wooden crates and steel shelving units. The warehouse was a labyrinth, and she used it to her absolute advantage. She heard the heavy boots of Silvio's men stomping on the concrete, their flashlights cutting through the dim lighting. "Check the eastern aisles," one of the men shouted. Eleanor held her breath, pressing her back flush against a stack of wooden pallets as a flashlight beam swept inches past her face. She waited until the man walked past, then silently slipped down the adjacent aisle, heading toward the rear loading docks. She was a ghost in the machine, using her intimate knowledge of the logistics floor to outmaneuver the armed hit squad. She reached the massive electrical breaker panel located near the rear exit. With a swift, decisive pull, she yanked the heavy iron lever down. The entire warehouse was instantly plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. Cries of confusion and anger echoed through the dark facility as Silvio's men stumbled blindly. Elena used the chaos to slip toward the heavy steel fire door at the back of the building. She pushed the crash bar, feeling the freezing winter air hit her face as the door swung open into the dark alleyway. She stepped out, her lungs burning, her hands instinctively clutching her stomach. She thought she had made it. She thought she was free. Well. Look at what we have here. Eleanor froze. The cold voice sent a shiver of absolute dread down her spine. A bright, tactical flashlight clicked on, blinding her. As her eyes adjusted to the harsh glare, she saw Silvio Caro standing at the end of the alleyway, a suppressed pistol aimed directly at her chest. He had anticipated her escape route. He stepped closer, lowering the flashlight, and a wicked, cruel smile spread across his scarred face as his eyes dropped to her swollen belly. "My God," Silvio laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "The great Pietro Serra is going to be a father. What a beautiful, unexpected bonus. You thought you could run, Elena? You just handed me the ultimate insurance policy." Silvio stepped forward, grabbing Elena roughly by the arm and shoving the barrel of his pistol against her temple. Elena gasped, stumbling backward against the cold brick wall of the alley, but she refused to cower. She squared her shoulders, her dark eyes flashing with a fierce, quiet defiance. She was not a helpless victim. She was the brilliant, unbreakable woman who held the heart of a monster, and she would not give Silvio the satisfaction of seeing her break. "If you pull that trigger, Silvio, you are a dead man," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "He will hunt you to the ends of the earth. There is no hole deep enough for you to hide in." Silvio sneered, pressing the gun harder against her skin. He is already hunting me, you stupid bitch. But once I send him a picture of his dead wife and his dead bastard child, he will break. I will destroy him from the inside out." The heavy steel fire door suddenly slammed open with the force of a bomb blast. Silvio whipped around, pulling Elena in front of him as a human shield, but he was entirely too late. A massive, towering figure stepped out of the dark warehouse into the freezing alleyway. It was Pietro. He looked like the Grim Reaper incarnate. His black overcoat billowed in the freezing wind, his eyes burning with an unholy, demonic rage that seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the air. He held a high-powered assault rifle in his hands, but he lowered it slightly as his eyes locked onto Elena. For the first time in 6 months, time stood completely still for both of them. Pietro's chest heaved as he took in the sight of her. He saw her pale face, her shivering frame, and the beautiful heavy swell of her pregnant belly. A profound, overwhelming wave of relief and furious obsession crashed through him. She was alive. His family was alive. "Let her go, Silvio," Pietro commanded. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, guttural vibration that carried the absolute certainty of death. Silvio laughed hysterically, tightening his grip on Elena's arm. "Drop the gun, Sarah. Drop it now, or I blow her brains out. You lose. I have the high ground here." Pietro did not blink. He did not hesitate. He did not negotiate. He moved with a speed that defied human physics. In a fraction of a second, he dropped the assault rifle, drew the heavy tactical pistol from his shoulder holster, and fired a single, perfect shot. The bullet struck Silvio dead center in his right eye. Silvio's body went completely rigid, the pistol slipping from his lifeless fingers as he collapsed backward onto the frozen asphalt, his blood pooling rapidly in the snow. Elena gasped, her knees finally buckling from the sheer shock of the violence. But she did not hit the ground. Pietro crossed the alleyway in 3 massive strides, catching her in his arms. He dropped his weapon, wrapping his large, scarred hands around her waist, pulling her soft, lush body flush against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling deeply, a broken, raw sound tearing from his throat. He held her so tightly she could barely breathe, but she didn't care. She wrapped her arms around his neck, sobbing into his coat, the terror of the last 6 months finally washing out of her in a flood of hot tears. She felt his large hands move down, cupping her swollen belly with a fierce, possessive reverence, his thumbs gently stroking the curve of her stomach. "Pietro, I am so sorry," Elena cried, her voice muffled against his chest. "I had to run. I had to protect you. I had to protect our baby." Pietro pulled back slightly, framing her beautiful tear-stained face in his large hands. His eyes were entirely soft, filled with a deep, endless devotion that he reserved solely for her. "You never have to protect me, mi amore," he whispered fiercely. "That is my job. That is my sole purpose in this world." He stepped back, keeping one protective arm wrapped securely around her waist. He raised his right hand, slowly pulling off the heavy leather glove. The massive silver signet ring gleamed under the harsh glare of the alleyway security light. Elena looked at it, confused. Pietro pressed his thumb against the crest, clicking the hidden mechanism. The top of the ring flipped open. He reached inside the tiny watertight compartment and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, holding it up for her to see. It was the broken pregnancy test strip, 2 faded pink lines. Elena stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as she looked up into Pietro's dark, intense gaze. "You knew," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You knew the whole time." Pietro smiled, a rare, beautiful expression that erased the brutal lines of his face. "I found it on the dresser right after you slipped out of the room," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I hid it in my ring before Silvio attacked the penthouse. I wore it every single day. I fought every single battle with our child resting against my skin. You thought you were fighting this war alone, Elena, but I was always with you." Fresh tears spilled over Elena's cheeks, but this time they were tears of profound joy. She threw her arms around his neck, kissing him deeply, tasting the freezing rain and the promise of a future she thought she had lost forever. Pietro kissed her back with absolute desperation, his hands wrapping securely around her pregnant frame, shielding her from the biting wind. He scooped her up into his arms, carrying her effortlessly toward the waiting armored convoy that had just arrived at the end of the alleyway. His men, the most lethal enforcers in the Serra Syndicate, formed an impenetrable, heavily armed wall around them. "Take us home," Pietro ordered his lead lieutenant, his voice returning to the cold, authoritative tone of a king who had finally reclaimed his throne. As they sat in the warm, secure back seat of the armored SUV, heading toward the private airfield, Elena rested her head against Pietro's broad chest. His heavy arm was wrapped protectively around her shoulders, his large hand resting permanently on her belly. The nightmare was finally over. Silvio Caro was dead, the syndicate was secure, and she was going back to Chicago, not as a woman hiding in the shadows, but as the untouchable queen of the Serra Empire. She closed her eyes, feeling the gentle, rhythmic kick of their unborn child against Pietro's palm. She knew they would face challenges again. They lived in a violent, unpredictable world that demanded constant vigilance. But as she listened to the steady, strong beat of Pietro's heart, she knew with absolute certainty that no force on earth, no rival family, and no dark twist of fate could ever tear them apart again. The ring that had carried their secret was now a symbol of their unbreakable bond, a promise forged in fire, blood, and an endless, consuming love. Did the pulse-pounding conclusion of Pietro and Elena's story leave you entirely breathless? If you loved this dark, high-stakes mafia romance and want to hear more thrilling tales of dangerous men and the brilliant women who tame them, please hit that like button right now. Share this story with your fellow romance readers. Leave a comment below telling me your favorite moment from the warehouse escape, and absolutely do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more gripping, immersive underworld drama. Your support keeps the stories alive.